Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this rather special MTL and World Childless Week collaboration tonight. A huge thank you goes to Stephanie Phillips, who's probably watching right now, for including More to Life in the 2019 World Childless Week event. Tonight's webinar, The Importance of Sharing Stories, marks this first day of 2019 World Childless Week, and tonight we fall under the theme of Our Stories. Now, we are very lucky to be joined by a very talented author, Kate Kaufmann, who lives without the children that she once hoped for. Kate understands fully the personal importance of getting her own story heard. Not only this, but her work as a writer has also provided so many others with a platform to share their experiences through her book, Do You Have Kids? Life When the Answer Is No. Kate will help us explore why sharing our stories is so important to us all on our journeys. Very warm welcome, Kate.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Heather. Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Lorna Gibb's unable to join us tonight, but we wish you well, Lorna, and hope to have you as a panelist another time. Now, we will begin this webinar tonight with Kate's presentation before moving on to a short Q&A session. Any questions that you may have can be typed in as you listen tonight. We will come back to discuss them once Kate has finished. Sorry, did I say Lorna and not Kate there? Once Kate's finished, we'll come back to the questions. Now, to submit questions, as always, simply hover your cursor down at the bottom of the screen and a toolbar should appear. Click on Q&A and type away. Please select the anonymous function to prevent any of your personal details being disclosed, as this webinar will be watched by others and is recorded. Okay, I think it's time to hear about why it is important to share our stories. Kate, I'm going to leave you now and come back a little bit later when you've finished your presentation. Have fun.
Well, thank you. And on this first day of World Childless Week, I'm a little gobsmacked with the fact that we are all together here, and I am aware of each and every person that is there, not only right now, but those who will stumble upon this webinar in the future. And I just thank you all for being here and to spending some time considering how important our stories are. I want to talk a little bit about why our stories are important. Why is the telling of our stories so powerful? And it strikes me that we have always been here. There have always been those of us who don't have children. And there will always be those of us who don't have children. And so in the telling of our stories lies the power of who we are as we're going through these lifetimes in ways that may not be as we originally intended or had hoped for, but it's the way that we are. And there is power in that. Otherwise, what we do is we invite the perpetuation of the stigmas and the stereotypes that have also been around forever and a day. And we have an opportunity to find the power and to avoid really sliding into that invisibility that can come from being part of a smaller part of the larger part of what it is to be a human. So why don't we share our stories? I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, because now that I know that there's so much power in sharing what we have to say, I reflect on the fact that we start out the same. We're all born, we walk our paths, and then people peel off when they start to become parents. And we continue along our path, perhaps right now not knowing where that path may lead, Perhaps having learned quite a long time ago, as I did, that this was not going to be a path that included having children of my own. Perhaps being in the process of being hopeful yet. Perhaps just having access to the knowledge or the hint of the reality that having kids may not be there for us. And we're in the early stages of including that reality that we never thought would be ours. Our personal paths, when I think about it, as another reason why we don't talk a lot, is because the ways we arrive here, it's so nuanced and unique to us at the same time as we share a lot of commonalities one with the other. And so, and because it's such a personal experience of going through the discoveries, going through the processes of learning that we are trying, that we are not arriving at the life we had hoped for, and that now we are integrating that new reality into who we are becoming. It's also dynamic that when we're sitting in the seat of the grief and perhaps the shock of discovery, perhaps the slow dawning of the fact that circumstances are not going to be as we wanted, we're going through a whole process that will continue really throughout our lifetimes. I'm now in my mid-60s, and now I've been given the privilege to steward the stories of other women and now also men, and to derive personally the power, the benefit, and the healing of those stories that has just been so very, very, very powerful in my own life and a gift to myself. And I know as a gift to others. So with that, I'm very, very honored to be here. And I do want to share some of my own story. I had what ended up being explained as unexplained infertility. I went through a full course of diagnostics and some of that vocabulary that every once in a while I lose some of the words and then I read something, and it's the self-same drugs, the self-same procedures, the self-same endless blood draws that many of you know exactly what I'm speaking of. My then husband and I tried for many years, went through the diagnostics. It was me. I had some endometriosis, probably still do. And come to find out, it just didn't happen. We went through a number of procedures and stopped short of going through IVF. And that was a personal choice to stop at that point for a whole host of reasons that many of you are very familiar with. Complicating or adding to the decision-making process was the whole time period. We aged during that time period. And I reached a point where my state of mind was, I was at a surfeit of challenge, and I was not in a good place. And I found that it was, in an odd way, an act of courage and independence, too, in conjunction with my then partner, my then husband, to make the decision that we had reached the point that enough was enough and it was time for us to move on. And at the time, we were living in a suburban community. We were in an excellent school district. We were both doing responsible jobs and earning responsible salaries. And as a result of making the decision to stop our process, we made what I can reflect on as kind of an odd choice. And that choice was, since we weren't going to now be paying for college educations and raising young children into full-grown human beings, that we had some different options. And so we chucked our corporate careers, we sold our suburban house, and we moved to a rural community and ultimately ended up raising sheep. That's a story for another day. But what we did do by that decision making was what I've now come to think of as more of like an immersion journalism kind of an experience. And really what it was that we lived in this environment where everyone had kids, everyone was part of a family. And so I found that created for me an elevated seed of need to go find people like me, because I did feel so much as an alien person in the community in which I lived. Not that I was unwelcome, but that I was just different than most of the people around me. And probably I was the one who was amplifying that difference, perhaps more than others. What I was looking for was the opportunity to hear those stories of primarily women like me. I couldn't fathom then that men might tell their stories, though I've come to know that that's very different. And what I really wanted, was the opportunity to talk to those women who would be like a mother that I wouldn't have, because this mother would be a mother that didn't have children. I was really interested in talking to not only my contemporaries, but also to women who would be able to provide that greater perspective of time and what my life might unfold like. And I've come to know that that is actually a common question for all of us when we have this picture of how our lives are going to unfold, and we learn that that's not how they're actually going to unfold now. Where do we turn to be able to picture what our lives might be like, not being as we had hoped them to be? And so I went on a conscious quest. I remember putting it I'm a planful kind of person, and I'm very fond of flip charts and doing things at the beginning of years to plan for what may come. And I had on a flip chart that I was going to go out recruiting and seeking friendships and contacts with people who didn't have kids. And I'd like to say that I found them quickly and easily, but I didn't. But over the course of time, I kept looking and I kept reading. And there was not a lot of material, but the material that I found was very, very, very helpful. And I realized that, wait a minute, if I represent 15 to 20% of the population, those who don't have children, technically every fifth to seventh person I meet may very well be statistically someone who didn't have kids. And so if I just kept looking and kept asking, that I might find some people who would be able to share their stories and perhaps someday hear my own. And in fact, that's what ended up happening. I met a woman who was very interested in talking to me as well. And she and I traded our stories little by little over the course of our budding friendship. And what we also ended up doing is, as we realized the power in what that meeting and sharing and contrasting our stories provided, was this picture of how our lives might unfold and how they already had unfolded, and how we could support and witness each other's experiences and articulate and hear our own stories in the telling. And so we decided, this was almost as a lark, but we decided to gather other women, and we did it specifically with women who we also knew and came across who didn't have children. And they ended up offering their friendships as well to come into these small gatherings. We get together for a couple of hours. We did them maybe once a quarter or something, usually with brand new people each time. And these ended up turning into what became just a really supportive way of seeing that not only was there an appetite for people to having these conversations, but there was a freedom and a shedding of inhibitions and shame and feeling alone and lonely that came from hearing and talking with one another and learning that we aren't alone. And so we kept doing that. And that's what helped me understand that I not only had the freedom to go and talk to other people about what their stories might be, but because I had the skills at writing, that I could go and be of service by gathering stories that then I could share with other people in the form of the book that Heather referred to. And that's what I did. And I gathered stories of women from their 20s to their 90s, everywhere in between. And what we looked at was really the impact of not having kids on how the rest of life unfolded. So how it impacted our work lives, how it impacted friendships and family relationships, specific things about our health and vulnerabilities that are more common when you don't have kids than when you do, and carrying it all the way through to how we looked at end-of-life planning and what we would leave behind, how our legacies can compare. And all of these conversations have been and continue to be just so incredibly rich. And I realized that many of us are at the beginnings of even considering that we might be able to tell our stories and wondering, how do we go about doing that? And I mentioned before that I considered a whole variety of resources, and now we have so many more resources. We have books that it seems like new books are coming out every day. We have Jody Day's beautiful book that came out a couple of years ago. Lorna Gibb's book that came out relatively recently, Leslie Pine, my own book. There are some, I'll be talking to Jackie Shannon Hollis later this week that has a book coming out next month. And there are the groups, the Gateway Women groups, the Not Mom Summit that I had the privilege of attending both times, meetup groups, and the World Childless Week. What a remarkable, remarkable way of, if we can't talk yet, if we don't feel comfortable sharing our stories yet, we have the freedom to listen. And from that listening comes the recognition that we're not alien. We're not these odd fellows and gals out there with no place to go. That in fact, there are many, many, many of us throughout the entire world. And we may well come to the time that we feel ready to share. And when I think about when that moment comes, the first thing that we have an opportunity to do, and that we will continue doing throughout the rest of our lives, because this topic will attach to us and it will always be part of our history, is that we take care of ourselves. We've all been to those gatherings, whether they're a party or something at work, when the "do you have kids" question comes up. We have license to choose how we want to handle those questions. We may need to flee. I spent many times saying, I don't, excuse me, please. And I would go sit and take some time to myself to try to find my bearings again, sometimes with tears. Sometimes I had to leave. And I gave myself finally permission to be able to do that and to not feel like I had to go into my own story unless I was ready to do that. And then something that has occurred to me relatively recently is that those of us who don't have kids, we have the benefit of knowing what our answer is. And so the idea of preparing for what will be a question we will be asked for the rest of our lives until our world and culture comes to the understanding that it really is the do you have kids question is such an invasive question that has so many stories behind it that those who are posing the question can never imagine. But we can be prepared for the fact that the question will come, and we can make our choices about how we want to handle those questions when they come, whether we're feeling at the moment ready to further explore with another person, whether we're ready to recognize that in fact we're in conversation with someone who is like us, that doesn't have children, and that we can explore the commonalities between our respective experiences. And when we're ready, that we can come to better understand different ways that people have managed this path in the past and are managing it now, that will have an impact on how we're going to go forward. I think it's easier to talk about the impact on our lives of not having children than it is to talk about the why we don't. It's somehow recognizing that our friendships are impacted and how we've navigated those challenges in friendships with family, that approaching the impacts makes it a little less daunting and a little less sharply personal. We can talk about talking about the topic. And one of the things that when the question comes up for me that I often will respond with is, no, I don't have children. Do you know other people who don't have children? Have you ever had a conversation about it? So the talking about it without actually talking about more personally that way. I mentioned earlier talking with those older. I cannot encourage those of us who are a little older, the power of the hair, to be, as we're able, more forthcoming about what our own personal experiences have been. That, again, is something that I have been able to create bridging with younger women and men that I had no idea the power that would come to me and to them through that experience. And I think lastly, what I want to caution is to really be aware of where our boundaries are, to honor our own boundaries, and then to test our own boundaries. Because the rewards and the payoff for being willing to hear stories that perhaps are different and contrasting to our own, and finding the courage to walk into that space where we share our own stories, the rewards are plentiful because it can create an amplification of what our futures may hold for us, and the jewels in our past that we can't even recognize today because they're still so cloudy. We haven't lived into who we will someday become. And I think there's a really good place to leave my things that I wanted to share, because most of all, I want a chance for us to talk through the questions that those of you who will be posing them will have. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for sharing that. While you were talking, I made copious notes, and I came up with a few thoughts myself. Now, um, at More to Life, we offer many different safe spaces and channels to tell our stories for our community. For example, we've got an online support forum, and what we find is the first few times that someone will use that, they will go on and they'll share their story, and they know it's a safe space within their own community with other people within a similar community. We also have volunteers who will have a telephone chat, a one-to-one telephone chat with somebody. Do you think it really matters which channel someone uses? Or do you think it's the fact that they're actually setting out to find the best channel for them that's important?
Oh, that's wonderful, because we're going into this unfamiliar space. Um, I think the channel is not as important as being very self-perceptive and watchful as to how receptive any particular channel is. And to walk into the space knowing that we're going to stumble, we're going to fall, we're going to perhaps meet with an edge that the person we're speaking to may not even be aware that they have, or that we're not aware that that's an edge for ourselves. And to just go slowly and purposefully, and to try and then regroup and then try again when we're able, and to listen in the in-between. Yeah.
I was also, while I was listening to you, I was thinking about some of the benefits of sharing our stories, and why it is so important to do it. And I came up with, when we share our stories with each other, we can learn tips from each other for ways to move on from the situation we're currently in.
Yes.
I also thought it creates a connection with the reality that you're facing. It can chip away at stigma.
Mm-hmm.
We're sharing our inner vulnerabilities, which is a very difficult thing to do, because
Yes.
what we're doing is we're admitting that our life isn't perfect. And I do think that in this world of social media at the moment, everybody shares the amazing things about their lives, beautiful picture from an amazing holiday they've been on, or an amazing meal they've had on Instagram or whatever. But actually those vulnerabilities, to share those, it can actually be quite liberating, can't it?
Oh my, it certainly can. And I was reading through the courageous stories that were posted today for World Childless Week. And hats off to those very brave people who put their stories out there. And the reading of the stories gives each of us courage, if only to take in those stories and to empathize with what others have experienced.
And I think it creates that awareness as well, that there are so many different ways to become involuntary childless. There are so many ways. It's some people, it's being childless by circumstance. Some people have been through many years of a fertility struggle. It's just, the list is endless, really. You couldn't name them all, but I think when we hear other people's stories, it reminds us that the world is bigger than our story as well. And there are lots of other reasons in there too. It's good to validate our own story, and to know that somebody wants to hear it, and to feel that it's giving you validation for what you've been through and what you've survived. But it's also good to hear that other people have had to survive other struggles too.
Yes, and you remind me of one of the more powerful stories that I heard from an older woman, and this was a woman in her mid 80s, and she came to be a college professor of philosophy, after losing her husband at a very young age, and she had always thought that she would have children. And she refers to what happened to her now as, the way she said it was so beautiful. It was like, I came to wear a suit of clothes I never thought I would, and it ended up being a well-tailored and appropriate way for us to be in the world. And it was like, wow, you came from all of that loss and grief into something that you can now characterize as a well-tailored suit of clothes.
So although her life didn't turn out the way she expected it to, which is what you were talking about earlier, she managed to feel comfortable in the skin that she was in the life that she found herself in, which is so powerful, isn't it?
Exactly, exactly. And going through all those stages of grief, and be able to say in retrospective, this is my life. And I found also that when people are thinking about legacy, that's another place that that comes up. Is I I have some freedom to look at what is my life's meaning. It's been very important to me to work with um, helping primary grade children learn how to read. And it's like, wow, things that I'm impacting in the world, they're never going to remember, but I'm never going to forget. And so, if I have anything left, I can leave something to help children that I will never ever ever know how to learn how to read a little better. I mean, wow.